Winter 1944. The sky above western France hung low, gray as melted lead, when the trucks rolled in. Canvas flaps snapped in the wind as a line of captured German women nurses, typists, clerks in wrinkled Wehrmacht uniforms climbed down into the mud. The gate slammed behind them, and the sound echoed through the barracks yard like a verdict. Boots crunched, dogs barked, and somewhere a generator coughed out diesel smoke thick enough to taste. This wasn't the battlefield they had trained for. It was something quieter, colder. Inside the compound, American guards watched. Some with curiosity, some with contempt. The war was tilting toward its end, and victory had begun to feel routine. But the sight of female POW, especially from the Reich, stirred something else. One sergeant muttered, "Didn't think they sent girls to war." Another laughed. Their laughter cut through the air sharper than the November wind. There were over 500,000 Axis prisoners in Allied hands across Western Europe by that year. Only a few thousand were women, scattered among male camps or held separately in makeshift enclosures. Their presence confused the system. The manuals didn't say what to do with them. To the Americans, these women weren't officers or enemies. They were curiosities wearing enemy gray. The convoy halted near a sign reading Stalag 18, F temporary section. The women stood shivering, rain dripping from their caps. An officer shouted through a megaphone, "Line up for inspection." One of the nurses, barely 20, tried to straighten her posture. Her fingers trembled, but she locked her jaw. The mud clung to her boots like punishment. From the watchtower, a guard with binoculars scanned their faces. He wasn't looking for weapons. He was studying expressions. The pride, the fear, the unfamiliar defiance. In that frozen moment, the line between discipline and humiliation began to blur. One German woman whispered under her breath, "They look at us not as soldiers, but as trophies." Her words vanished in the wind, but the meaning lingered. The officer barked again, this time slower, his accent chewing through every syllable. "Remove your insignia, all of them." The women froze. One reached for the small eagle stitched over her breast pocket. She hesitated, then tore it off. The fabric ripped with a sound that felt final. And as the gray patch fell into the mud, the next humiliation quietly began to take shape. The rain had slowed, but the cold stayed sharp, unkind, almost surgical. The women stood in a crooked line, soaked uniforms clinging to their knees, their breath hanging white in the air. An American officer with a clipboard walked down the row, boots squelching in the mud. "Remove all badges, pins, rank marks, everything," he said, tone clipped, deliberate. The order sliced through them like a quiet insult. One woman hesitated, a former Red Cross nurse. She'd worn that insignia since 1941. It wasn't pride, it was identity, but the sergeant behind her jabbed his finger toward her chest. Now. The sound of tearing cloth filled the yard, dozens of tiny rips like paper surrendering. Gray patches, once symbols of authority, fell into puddles and vanished under the weight of dirty water. Over 500,000 Axis prisoners sat behind Allied fences by late 1944, but only about 3% were women. There were no clear rules for them, no separate barracks designed for female soldiers. To the Americans, they were anomalies, half military, half embarrassment. The Geneva Convention was pinned on the camp office wall, its promises bold and untouched. But that morning, no one read the parts about dignity. As the officer moved on, one guard muttered, "Should have thought twice before following Hitler." Another smirked, "They'll learn respect here." The women kept their eyes fixed on the ground, afraid that even looking up might spark laughter or worse. A young translator, barely 20, too, shifted uncomfortably near the back. He'd been told these inspections were standard procedure. But something about the slow, deliberate stripping felt wrong, too personal. The rain had stopped, yet the humiliation dripped on, steady as the ticking of his wristwatch. When the officer finally stepped away, the women stood bare of every mark that once gave them purpose. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were detainees. Their ranks, their roles, their histories absorbed into mud and paperwork. One German nurse whispered, almost prayer, like, "We are invisible in the laws they quote." The translator heard her. He didn't correct her. Then from the barracks door, the same sergeant who had been watching them earlier appeared, belt hanging loose from his hand, brass buckle gleaming in the dull light. He smiled without warmth and called out, "All right, ladies. Inspection's not over yet." The humiliation was about to turn physical. The yard smelled of damp metal and diesel. The women hadn't moved since the last order. Their coats hung heavy, soaked through. Their eyes followed the sergeant, pacing like a man rehearsing a performance. He tapped his belt buckle with one gloved finger, slow, deliberate, almost rhythmic. "You want to serve your rye," he said, voice steady but venomous. "Then polish this." For a moment no one understood. Then one woman, blonde, barely older than 20, was yanked forward. The guard motioned to the ground, "Kneel." The gravel bit into her knees. The brass buckle stared back at her, the American eagle embossed in perfect shine. He tossed her a rag. "Show me what you learned in the Reich." Around them boots shifted. Some guards smirked, others turned away. It wasn't written anywhere in the rulebook, but the power in that gesture was unmistakable. This wasn't discipline. It was theater, humiliation dressed as order. Reports later described isolated incidents of misconduct in POW camps despite command oversight. But no paperwork could capture this moment's intimacy, its quiet cruelty. The woman rubbed the rag over the metal, her hands trembling. The sound of fabric against brass scratched through the cold silence. Behind her, the other women stood frozen, each realizing what might come next. She finished, eyes fixed on the reflection in the buckle. It wasn't her face she saw, it was the sergeant's grin bending over her. The buckle shone like mockery. One POW you later wrote in her post, war testimony. "It showed me smaller than I ever thought I could be." The sergeant stepped closer, inspected the gleaming surface, and nodded. "Good, now you others. Do the same." A wave of disbelief passed through the line. One woman shook her head slightly. The sergeant's hand twitched toward his holster. No words followed. The next woman stepped forward, knelt, and took the rag. One by one, they began polishing the belts of their captors, an assembly line of submission beneath the gray French sky. The translator watched from the gatehouse, jaw clenched. He knew what this would look like in reports, maintenance exercise, but he also knew what it was, domination disguised as routine. When the last belt shone, the sergeant slung it around his waist and whispered, "Now they look like they respect us." He turned, eyes landing on the next row. "Next shift. Your turn." The gravel turned darker with moisture and sweat. By now, a dozen women knelt shoulder to shoulder, each clutching a rag or scrap of cloth, scrubbing brass until it glowed like fire in the overcast light. The sound was relentless, fabric rasping against metal, the faint clink of buckles dropped into the mud, and the uneven rhythm of boots pacing behind them. The humiliation had become choreography, each woman focused on the same tiny surface, afraid to look up. The sergeant's shadow drifted from one to another, his voice low, mocking, "Shine it till I see myself." The irony cut deeper than the cold. In the Reich, these women had been trained to salute the same symbol now dangling above their heads, except this time it wasn't an eagle of their nation. It was the enemy's emblem, burning with reflected pride. There were no official records of this line, no inspection note that read forced labor. On paper, it would be camp maintenance. In reality, it was slow disintegration. Over 60% of POW under Allied control were used for camp upkeep, latrines, kitchens, cleaning gear. But this was not labor. This was theater of domination. A nurse in the middle whispered through cracked lips, "They want our shame to sparkle." Another beside her muttered, "Then let it blind them." For a split second, their whispers carried defiance, quiet, trembling, but alive. The sergeant didn't notice. He was busy lighting a cigarette, smoke curling between his teeth. "Faster," he ordered. Gravel bit into knees, fingers raw and bleeding where the rag scraped skin. The women kept moving, synchronized by fear and fatigue. The translator in the corner couldn't bear to look anymore. He turned toward the barracks, pretending to check a clipboard. "The earth bit into our skin before the cloth even did," one of them later recalled. "It was like the ground itself punished us for kneeling." When the final belt was done, the sergeant let the silence stretch. The wind hissed through the wire. He smirked, then tossed one rag into a puddle. "Good. Now remember what respect looks like." As the women slowly rose, knees trembling, one of them whispered a prayer not for rescue, but for numbness. Because numbness, at least, didn't bleed. And from the watchtower above, another guard leaned forward and called down, "Hey, Sarge, mine could use some shine too." The next morning arrived without color. Mist drifted through the camp, wrapping the barbed wire like gauze. Inside the yard, one belt gleamed brighter than any other, the sergeant's. Its brass buckle, freshly polished, caught the faint winter light, throwing small flashes onto the faces of the women forced to make it shine. He noticed it too, touching the metal as if it were a medal earned in battle. "Perfect," he murmured. "Now that's American discipline." The women were made to line up again, same formation, same cold gravel beneath their knees. But this time the humiliation had a cruel familiarity. The sergeant unhooked his belt and let it hang loose from his hand, the eagle insignia catching breath from the wind. He stepped toward the first woman. "You missed a spot yesterday," he said. "Do it again." The rag in her hand was stiff with dried polish. She bent forward and rubbed. The brass stared back like an unblinking eye. The power dynamic was unmistakable. She kneeling, he towering, the emblem glinting between them like judgment itself. U.S. Army manuals of the time listed uniform presentation as essential to morale: belts, boots, brass, all symbols of order and pride. Yet here, that same principle had been twisted into something intimate and cruel. The shine that once represented discipline now reflected domination. She kept polishing, the reflection in the buckle warping her face. I could see myself in the buckle, she would later recall. Smaller than a coin. The words would survive decades later in a Red Cross interview no one wanted to publish. When she finished, the sergeant inspected the belt again, then gave a small, satisfied nod. "That's more like it." He wrapped the belt slowly around his waist, cinching it tight, savoring the silence around him. Then he turned, pointing at another soldier leaning against a post. "She'll do yours next." The laughter that followed was short and cruel, echoing off the tin barracks. The women didn't react. Their eyes were fixed on the mud, each heartbeat syncing with the rhythm of boots shifting nearby. The sergeant walked off, belt shining like a trophy in the fog. Behind him, another guard was already unbuckling his own, tossing it toward the line. "Let's see if she can make mine brighter." And just like that, the ritual spread. By afternoon, the camp settled into a strange rhythm. The clang of mess tins, the shuffle of boots, and somewhere the faint scraping of cloth against metal. The polishing hadn't stopped. It had only changed hands. The same gravel yard now hosted a quiet ritual that no one openly discussed, but everyone knew. A few American soldiers watched from the barracks porch. Cigarettes glowed faintly between their fingers. Some looked uneasy, others amused. "Ain't hurting anyone," one muttered, "just keeping them busy." Another replied, "Still feels wrong." The first man shrugged. "Not our problem." Silence followed, thick and cowardly. In every army, silence is its own uniform. You wear it to blend in, to avoid friction. Reports indicate that U.S. military police logged discipline breaches in camp logs but rarely escalated them. Out of thousands of incidents, only a fraction reached inquiry. The rest vanished in the noise of victory. A medic named Collins stood by the gate, pretending to count supplies. He had seen the first kneeling line the night before and hadn't slept since. When he approached the sergeant earlier, suggesting it looked bad, the response had been a smirk. "You think the brass cares what a couple kraut girls polish?" Collins hadn't replied. He knew what silence would cost him. One of the women looked up briefly as he passed. Her face was raw from wind and exhaustion. For a split second, Collins' gaze met hers. He saw no defiance there, only disbelief. Like someone still waiting to wake from a dream, he looked away. "Rules are rules," he muttered under his breath, though he didn't sound convinced. Their silence was permission, a survivor later said. Every pair of eyes that looked away gave the act another hour of life. As evening crept in, the belts gleamed across the barracks, catching the last thin streaks of sunlight. The sergeant leaned back against a jeep, proud of the shine. "You see that," he told another guard. "Even prisoners can learn polish." That night, when the floodlights flickered on, a new notice appeared on the bulletin board outside the command hut. It was typed clean, stamped official. All prisoners will adhere to camp decorum and cleanliness standards at all times. The women read it in silence. The irony wasn't lost on them. The next morning, the notice flapped in the wind like a taunt. Typed in perfect military form, signed, stamped, and posted at eye level. All POW will be treated humanely. The words looked clean, righteous, even comforting until you saw the man standing under them. The same sergeant from yesterday, belt shining like a mirror, smirking as he walked past the paper. The women lined up again, their eyes flicking between the rule on the wall and the gleam on his waist. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had promised protection from insults and public curiosity. It was the moral armor of civilized warfare. But here, the paper hung useless, an empty shield fluttering above muddy boots. No one enforced it. No one dared test it. For these women, it was as if the ink itself was mocking them. Inside the administrative hut, the translator Kaplan sat at his desk, typing reports. His fingers hovered above the keys, reluctant. He'd overheard the laughter, seen the polishing, but every line he wrote blurred the line between truth and survival. Routine maintenance drills observed. He finally typed. The lie left a sour taste in his mouth. Outside, the camp buzzed with new orders. The sergeant strutted across the yard, barking at guards to tighten patrols and keep the women busy. The belts, now immaculate, had become proof of discipline. He wore his like a victory ribbon. "See," he joked, "even the enemy knows how to shine freedom." The words drew a few forced chuckles, but behind those laughs was unease. When evening came, the air turned heavy with rain. The women huddled inside their barracks, whispering beneath the sound of water dripping through the roof. One muttered, "They obey the law by day, unmake it by night." Another replied, "The paper says humane, the belt says otherwise." Outside, lightning flashed, lighting up the fence and the notice at once, the noble sentence and the mocking smirk beneath it. For a heartbeat, both looked the same, hollow light in a dark place. The storm grew louder, thunder cracking like artillery. Guards hurried under cover, but one young, bored lingered near the barracks window, tapping his flashlight on the wall. "Night shift inspection in 10 minutes," he called. Rain or not, the show was about to begin again. The rain didn't stop. It only changed rhythm. Drops hissed on corrugated roofs, pooled in the dirt, and turned the camp into a mirror of gray. By nightfall, the yard looked abandoned, but inside the guards were restless. Floodlights flickered through sheets of rain, slicing across faces half us. Leap in bunks. Then came the call, inspection, 10 minutes, boots thudded outside. The door to the women's barracks swung open, banging against the wall. The sergeant stepped in, soaked but grinning, belt gleaming under the weak light. "Up," he ordered. "Belts and boots, let's see if you still remember how to shine in the rain." His voice carried the same mocking authority as before, half command, half performance. The women hesitated. The floor was slick with mud, the air heavy with wet wool and fear. They had just finished drying their rags from the last session, now damp again from leaking roofs. The sergeant dropped his belt onto the nearest bunk. "Do it for inspection." Reports indicate that by early 1945, Allied camps in Western Europe held over 2,000 female auxiliaries, nurses, radio operators, clerks. Most followed Geneva standards. Some, like this temporary section, slipped through the cracks of oversight. One woman knelt, trembling, as thunder rolled above. The lamp overhead buzzed weakly, its light flickering on her hands. She scrubbed the brass in small circles, her reflection shimmering between raindrops and metal. "Faster," the sergeant said, his voice cutting through the storm. Another guard laughed quietly, lighting a cigarette despite the drizzle. The cloth was never clean enough. One survivor later wrote, "Every night they found new dirt that didn't exist." Outside, Kaplan, the translator, stood near the guard post, notebook hidden under his coat. He could hear the voices, the scraping, the laughter. His stomach knotted. Finally, he scribbled something down. Unscheduled inspection, during heavy rain, possible misconduct. It was the first time he put the word misconduct in writing. Inside, the sergeant clapped once. "That's enough. Tomorrow, we'll do it again. Maybe daylight will help you see the spots you missed." The belts were collected, their shine invisible in the stormlight, but deeply felt in the silence that followed. Kaplan closed his notebook, heart pounding. He knew what he'd heard tonight could end his career, or expose the truth. By dawn, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The yard steamed faintly, a shallow fog crawling across the mud. Inside the admin hut, Private Aaron Kaplan sat hunched over his typewriter, fingers hovering just above the keys. He'd barely slept. The sound of last night, the scraping rags, the laughs kept looping in his head. His job was simple: translate, record, and report, but now his conscience had entered the paperwork. The complaint lay before him, a thin sheet of lined paper, folded twice, still damp at the edges. It was written in shaky German, words pressed so hard they nearly tore through. Forced to clean officers' belts on knees. Humiliation disguised as inspection. The women had slipped it to him through the barracks window at dawn, trusting him not as an American, but as a man. Kaplan's jaw tightened. He read it again, slower this time. His father had fled Berlin in 1938. His mother still prayed in Yiddish at home in Brooklyn, and now he was sitting here, wearing the same uniform as the men these women feared. The contradiction cut deep. Reports show that less than 1% of POW complaints ever reached Allied command, most labeled disciplinary misunderstandings. Kaplan knew exactly how those words killed truth. He'd seen complaints rewritten, softened, erased. The line between moral duty and military order was paper, thin, and printed on government stationery. He stared at the signature at the bottom of the page, just initials H. K. He imagined her face, the trembling hands holding that pencil in the dark. When the sergeant entered the hut, dripping rainwater and arrogance, Kaplan slid the paper beneath a stack of blank forms. "Morning, Private," the sergeant said, smirking. "Still writing your little stories?" Kaplan forced a smile. "Just reports, sir." The sergeant tapped his gleaming belt buckle with one finger. "Make sure they shine in the files, too." Then he left. Kaplan exhaled slowly. The room smelled of wet canvas and coffee gone cold. He pulled the paper back out, hesitated, then folded it smaller, pocket size. "Not filed, not destroyed, just hidden." He read our words. H.K. would later write in a post, war memoir, then folded them away. Kaplan glanced through the rain-streaked window toward the yard, where sunlight was catching the same buckle that had started it all. 2 days later, the camp looked almost civilized. Mud had been raked, flags straightened, and belts, of course, were spotless. Word spread that a general from headquarters was visiting for inspection. Everything had to shine. The same women who had spent nights kneeling in gravel now stood in formation, lined up like exhibits of discipline. Their faces blank, uniforms stiff with dried rain, they waited as the convoy approached. Engines rumbled beyond the wire. Trucks rolled in, tires slicing through puddles. A jeep stopped near the flagpole, and out stepped a broad, shouldered officer with polished boots and eyes like glass. "Looks tidy," he said, surveying the camp. The sergeant beamed, his belt reflecting the morning sun as if to greet him personally. "Thank you, sir. We maintain strict order here." The general nodded. A photographer followed, snapping frames for the record. Wide shots, smiles, compliance. Everything looked perfect from a distance. The belts gleamed like trophies. The prisoners stood upright, and the script of discipline held strong. What those lenses didn't capture was the silence behind every motion. No chatter, no whispers, just the mechanical obedience of people too tired to resist. One woman's fingers trembled slightly at her sides. The nurse beside her reached out, subtly steadying her hand. That small touch, illegal, human, went unseen by the men inspecting them. In official Allied records, over 84% of POW camps were rated satisfactory or higher during inspections. Paper didn't measure shame, it measured shine, and on that day this camp scored perfectly. The general turned to the sergeant. "Good work," he said, "discipline's clear." The sergeant saluted, chest proud, buckle winking in the light. Behind him, Kaplan stood near the gate, expression unreadable. He knew this charade well. Every inspection cleaned the surface, but deepened the rot underneath. The camera saw order. "One POW," you later wrote, "but order has many shapes. Ours looked like obedience, theirs looked like pride." When the general's convoy finally rolled out, dust rose behind it, soft and golden in the afternoon sun. The laughter of officers faded with the engines. As the sound died, the sergeant turned back toward the women. The smile left his face. The photo op was over, and so was restraint. The camera clicked again and again, each flash freezing a lie. The photographer crouched low, adjusting his lens to capture discipline and order, the official phrase that would later caption this image in archives. Behind the lens, he saw symmetry. Prisoners aligned, uniforms neat, guards upright. What he didn't capture was the tremor in the women's knees or the way their eyes avoided the sunlight that glared off those cursed brass buckles. The sergeant stood proudly at the center of the frame, his belt the brightest object in the yard. "Hold it steady," he told the photographer. "Make it look sharp." The man nodded, unaware that the word sharp carried two meanings here, one for focus, one for pain. The shutter snapped. That image, preserved in a folder labeled Camp Discipline, France, 1944, would survive long after the mud and uniforms were gone. It would hang decades later in a museum display, stripped of context, tagged only with the year and a generic description. Female German POW under inspection. The truth, the humiliation that gave the photo its shine, remained unspoken. Thousands of photographs like it exist from that era. Historians estimate over 50,000 images were taken in Allied POW camps, most without captions explaining what really happened. For morale, officials called it proof that the system worked, but photographs lie gracefully. They freeze power without showing what it costs. As the flashbulb burned out, one of the women blinked too late. For an instant, the afterimage left her blinded, seeing only white light. That picture lied longer than we could speak. She would write years later. In that photograph, her posture looked composed. No one could tell her knuckles bled beneath the seams of her gloves. The photographer packed his camera, nodded to the officer, and left. The yard fell silent except for the faint sound of a belt buckle jingling as the sergeant adjusted it one more time. "Looks perfect," he said. "History will remember it that way." And he was right. History would remember the photo, not the pain. Years later, one of those women would walk through a Berlin museum and stop cold before a familiar image on the wall. The caption read, "Captured Auxiliaries, Allied Camp, 1944. Her knees remembered before her mind did. Berlin, 1953. The city had healed just enough to start pretending it wasn't still bleeding. Rubble was swept into corners, trams screeched along rebuilt tracks, and in the museum district, glass cases gleamed with sanitized fragments of the past. One woman, gray coat, steady walk, eyes older than her years, moved through the hallway of a new exhibition, War and Reconstruction. She wasn't looking for herself. But she found her. The photograph hung beside a display of Allied POW documentation, captioned simply, "Captured German Women, France, 1944. In the frame, a line of women kneeling in gravel, faces half, hidden by shadow, and there, at the edge of the composition, barely visible, her own hand clutching a rag against a soldier's shining belt. She stopped breathing. The museum air smelled faintly of dust and varnish, but all she could taste was wet gravel and diesel again. A boy nearby whispered to his mother, "They look proud." The mother nodded absently, reading the placard aloud. Example of discipline and cooperation. The woman turned away, her pulse hammered like gunfire in her ears. It had been nearly a decade since she'd left that camp, a decade of silence, nursing, survival. Over 30,000 German women had served as auxiliaries during the war. Typists, nurses, radio operators. Most had returned home to a nation that didn't want their stories, only their silence. "I thought history forgot." She would later say, "It didn't, it just edited." Outside the museum, she sat on a bench, staring at the fog creeping along Unter den Linden. She had rebuilt her life brick by brick, like the city itself, functional, scarred, unspoken. But that photo had undone years of careful forgetting. The shame wasn't just memory now, it was public record. Her hands trembled as she reached into her bag, pulling out a folded letterhead from her hospital. She flipped it over and began to write, not to accuse, not even to be believed, just to release. Each word came out like breath she'd been holding since 1944. The story she'd buried in silence was clawing its way back into the world. By dusk, the page was filled. At the bottom, she signed only her initials H.K., and sealed it in an envelope marked to the editor, Munich Daily News. Munich, 1954. A gray morning mist hugged the rooftops as male clerks sorted envelopes by the hundreds. Among them, one plain white envelope slipped through unnoticed, no return address. No seal, but a careful fold. Inside, a 3-page letter written in elegant, restrained German. Its first line read, "There was an order to kneel." The editor of the Munich Daily News, a war-hardened journalist named Otto Brandt, opened it during lunch. He expected another denunciation, another bitter political tirade. Instead, he found something quieter, sharper. It wasn't a rant, it was memory distilled into confession. The writer, signing only as H.K., described the camp, the gravel yard, the belt buckles. Her sentences were clean, almost surgical. "He made us kneel." One line read, "We polished the symbol of their freedom until it erased ours." Brandt stopped chewing, eyes fixed on the paper. This wasn't a propaganda piece. It was testimony. He read it twice. By the second reading, his cigarette had burned down to the filter. He underlined one phrase, "Shame is a slow uniform, you wear it for life." It wasn't self-pity. It was an observation so precise, so devastating. It felt like it could only come from someone who had outlived humiliation. Brandt debated what to do. Post-war Germany was drowning in competing stories, victims, villains, survivors. No one wanted another confession that didn't fit cleanly into guilt or innocence. Printing this could cost the paper sponsors. But burying it would feel like complicity. He locked the letter in his desk drawer, promising himself he'd decide tomorrow. But newsrooms have their own currents. A junior reporter, curious and reckless, found the letter later that evening while cleaning up. Thinking it routine correspondence, he placed it in the stack for reader letters to be reviewed. By dawn, it was already circulating through the newsroom. Within a week, the letter appeared in a Sunday supplement under the headline, "Confession of an Unknown Woman, the Belts We Polished." Readers were stunned. Some dismissed it as fiction, others as exaggeration, but veterans quietly, privately recognized the tone. It wasn't the words that haunted them, it was the precision of the details no outsider could invent. Across the Atlantic, in an office in Washington, a clerk clipped the article for archival interest and filed it under POW Behavior Reports Miscellaneous. And that's where history found it. 1971, Washington, D.C. The story resurfaced like a ghost that refused burial. A graduate student researching post, where POW ethics, stumbled upon a yellowed clipping titled "The Belts We Polished." It had been sitting, untouched, in a federal archive for nearly 2 decades, its edges crumbling, its words still electric. Within weeks, the letter of H.K. spread across newspapers, think pieces, and late-night radio. The past had suddenly found its voice again. On Radio America, a veteran caller rasped, "That's not how we treated them. We followed the rules." Another listener fired back, "Rules? You think humiliation was regulation." The debate turned national. Talk shows dissected every sentence of that anonymous confession. The country wanted to believe its army had been spotless. But every empire has dust where light doesn't reach. Military historians dove into archives. Reports once marked routine maintenance began to look different when read aloud beside H.K.'s words. One researcher, Dr. Elaine Porter, presented findings that cited 14 confirmed cases of female POW mistreatment under Allied watch between 1944 and 1945. 14 out of 500,000 doesn't erase the fact. She told the Post, "It proves it happened, and it was hidden." For the first time, the words belt buckle carried the weight of moral indictment. Newspapers printed the phrase in bold. Veterans groups condemned the coverage, calling it anti-American revisionism. But others, mostly medics and clerks who had served, wrote in quietly, confirming details that no novelist could have invented. The rain, the gravel, the silence. H.K.'s story had cracked open a memory the nation didn't want to touch. They called it rumor until paper proved it, wrote one editorialist. But rumor is just history whispering before the evidence wakes up. Television crews sought the mysterious author. No one found her. Some said she had died years earlier. Others claimed she was living quietly as a nurse in West Berlin. The mystery only deepened the impact. One evening, broadcast aired the original photograph, the same one that once hung in the Berlin Museum. The camera zoomed slowly toward the kneeling figure, until the frame was filled with the gleam of a belt buckle. The host's voice trembled slightly. For some, it was duty, for others, degradation. And somewhere in an archive basement, one historian kept digging, looking for the man behind that buckle. The historian's name was Dr. Elaine Porter, the same one who'd first tallied those 14 confirmed cases. But this wasn't research anymore, it had become pursuit. Deep inside the National Personnel Records Center, under flickering fluorescent lights, she leafed through folders stamped Declassified, Restricted Conduct, 1944. Her pen hovered when one file caught her eye. Staff Sergeant William H. Danner Military Police, France Sector. She flipped it open. Inside was a commendation dated December 1944 for maintaining strict discipline among female POW personnel, exemplary presentation of troops. Porter frowned. The phrasing was too polished, too rehearsed. She scanned the attachments, no photos, just a typed memo praising innovative cleanliness drills. Her pulse quickened. There it was, buried in plain sight. Archival data shows over 9,000 military police investigations into misconduct during World War II. Yet only a handful reached court, martial. Most were filed under disciplinary discretion, a bureaucratic phrase that scrubbed violence into procedure. Porter underlined one line in the sergeant's record, demonstrated authority through direct engagement with detainees. She read it again. Direct engagement, the same euphemism that sanitized humiliation. For hours she referenced transfer logs, inspection photos, signatures. Then one document slipped free, a personnel inventory, noting one brass officer's belt exemplary condition retained upon reassignment. Her throat tightened. She looked up at the archivist. "Do you have a picture of him?" The man nodded, disappearing into a drawer. When he returned, he handed her a black and white portrait. Danner stared out of it with the calm pride of someone certain his uniform meant righteousness. His belt buckle gleamed even in the faded print. Porter felt her stomach twist. He polished his medals, she whispered, as they polished his belt. She placed the photo beside the anonymous museum, image H.K., kneeling in gravel, face half, hidden, two halves of the same story finally in one frame. The symmetry was unbearable, her notepad filled with names, file numbers, contradictions. She'd write the report, she told herself, but for now she just sat there silent, staring at the glint frozen on that belt. And as the overhead lights buzzed, Porter made one final note in the margin. History doesn't absolve, it archives. Then she closed the file and booked a train ticket to France. France, 1972. The train screeched into a quiet countryside station, air thick with the smell of wet soil and diesel. Dr. Elaine Porter stepped off, holding a single leather satchel stuffed with copies of declassified reports. The locals barely looked up. The war had ended almost 3 decades ago, but some landscapes never moved on. They just learned to grow grass over ghosts. She rented a small car and drove south along a dirt road until she reached what remained of the old Stalag camp. There was no fence anymore, no guard towers, only rusted fragments of wire tangled in weeds. A farmer had turned part of the ground into pasture, cows grazing over what had once been the yard of humiliation. The wind pressed gently against her coat, as she walked through the field, stopping near a patch of half-buried gravel. This was the place. She knew it without question. The geography matched the photographs, the slope of the hill, the bend in the stream. Porter knelt, brushing her hand through the soil. Her fingers touched something cold, small, circular. She dug gently until it came free. A buckle, corroded but unmistakable, its eagle emblem still faintly visible beneath the rust. She sat back, holding it in her palm. "Every object remembers," she murmured, "even when we don't." Records show that only about 12% of Allied POW camps were ever marked or memorialized. The rest, like this one, were swallowed by farmland, factories, or silence. Porter's discovery wouldn't make headlines. It wouldn't rewrite textbooks, but it completed a circle that had been left open since 1940. For the victim's letter, the photograph, the name, and now the artifact itself. A truck passed in the distance, the sound fading like thunder long gone. Porter looked around, the field empty, the sky pale with approaching rain. She slipped the buckle into a cloth pouch, whispering as if to the woman who had once polished it, "You're seen now." When she stood, her reflection caught briefly in a puddle, a distorted figure framed by the ruins of history. She took one final photograph, her own knees bent at the same patch of earth where H.K. had knelt. That night, back in her hotel room, she stared at the buckle on the table beside her typewriter and began to write the final paragraph of her report. But she hesitated, unsure how to end a story that never truly ended. The film opened with silence, just wind, soft, hollow, endless, blowing over a field in France. Then the screen faded into a black and white photograph, women kneeling in gravel, a line of soldiers standing over them, sunlight flashing off brass. Dr. Elaine Porter's voice came in, calm, deliberate. "This image was once called discipline, but history teaches us that shine and shame can look the same through a camera lens." Her documentary, "The Belts We Polished," aired quietly on a public broadcast channel in late 1974. No dramatic music, no narration of blame, just testimony, photographs, and the echo of rain on canvas roofs. Porter's script let silence do the talking. It ended where it began, with that photograph zooming closer and closer until only the belt buckle filled the frame, gleaming like an unblinking eye. Reports estimate that over 70 million people worldwide were displaced during the war. Yet this story, this single humiliation, cut through the statistics because it was intimate. It wasn't about armies or nations. It was about power stripped to its smallest gesture. In interviews, Porter refused to name the sergeant or the women beyond their initials. "It's not about vengeance," she told one journalist. "It's about acknowledgement. History doesn't heal, but it listens." When the film ended, the credits rolled over archival stills. Rusted wire, empty barracks, the corroded buckle she had found, now resting in a museum case, labeled simply Recovered Artifact, France. 1944, the lighting made it glow softly, neither accusing nor forgiving, just existing. Audiences sat wordless. Some veterans wept quietly. Others left the room without speaking. For a moment, the usual noise of history arguments, statistics, moral posturing fell away. All that remained was that faint metallic glint, the sound of cloth on brass, and the image of someone kneeling in the mud, obeying an order that never should have been given. Porter's final words echoed before the screen faded to black. "Not every wound bleeds. Some just shine too long." Then the screen went dark, leaving only the reflection of the audience faces lit, silent, caught between memory and recognition. And somewhere in that darkness, history exhaled, not absolved, just seen,